Welcome to the kingdom. I'm Chris, and this is Good Enough Gaming. Well, howdy folks, and welcome back to this painting tutorial where I'm going to be painting a OnePageRules model. I know, kind of sad given what the channel's focused on, but I have here a 3D printed HDF OGRE. And what's really interesting about this particular guy, this is an FDM job. This isn't resin, and I was amazed at how well it printed, especially given the amount of wash we're going to put on this thing. It still did not have any lines. I was shocked. But a buddy of mine had printed up a bunch of 3D terrain, and in exchange, I was going to paint up some of his models, and I thought, why not turn this one into a tutorial? Now, he wanted a desert theme. So, first thing you do, I spray painted it and primed it with Xandri Dust, because Xandri Dust is a really good sandy color that darkens easily, that highlights easily. It's a very, very easy paint to work with. When it's all done, this is what it's going to look like. So I did a test model beforehand to make sure that it turned out the way I wanted. So now let's get into it. First thing we want to do is actually bring down the color and create some shadow, and then we're going to dry brush it back up to a brighter color. Now, the one really nice thing about Xandri Dust and Agrax Earthshade, they were made for each other. It goes on very, very nicely, and here's where I was worried the FDM part of the model would show up and you'd see the print lines, but I believe he said this was used, that he printed it using a 0.2 nozzle. I'll get him to confirm, but again, I was amazed at how little I could see the paint lines, or rather the print lines. And on top of that, he prints all of his models standing straight up. He doesn't even do it at an angle so that the print lines are slanted and you can't see them. So this guy was printed bottom up, standing straight up. Now, when it's done and dried, that's actually a pretty good looking desert color right there. You got some nice shadows, and all we have to do is bring up the edges to give him a weathered desert look. So the first thing we have to do, and I know this sounds weird, we now have to dry brush with that original color. You could, if you wanted to, do a pinpoint detail and put the wash in just the recesses without having to do the whole thing, but believe it or not, it's faster to wash the whole thing and then dry brush it with your original color. I don't know why, that's just the way that it works. It's quicker that way. So we give this guy a pretty good strong dry brushing to bring back that lighter khaki kind of color. So now we're going to do one more light dry brush of Karak Stone. It's a lighter khaki color just to get some of the really sharp edges. When doing this dry brush, only pull the brush down rather than go in circles or try and get all the crevices. We only want not only the sharpest ridges, but just the ones on top that would catch the light. So after the wash and the two dry brush layers, we have a very worn, not grungy, but definitely dirty, weathered khaki look to him. Now we needed to do that first because everything else is detail and we didn't want to get dry brush all over it. So now that the bulk of the armor is painted, let's get some of the metal. So for the feet and then the joints in the arms. You can decide where you want to paint the silver. I figured I would stop right where that hinge joint is at the ankle, because I wanted most of this guy to be that khaki color, but you still want to have some of the metal in there just to make it look more robot-y, more mech-like. If it was entirely camo, I don't think it would have turned out quite as well. You need some contrast. You want to break up some color in there. Now, once that layer of silver is dry, we definitely want to put some kind of a wash on it. Otherwise, it looks too clean. So you could either get black wash, like Nuln Oiled, simply to darken it and give it a little bit more definition, or you could use a brown or a sepia to give it kind of a rusty, dirty look, like maybe there's sand gunked on it, things like that. I figure the rest of the model's got enough dust and khaki and sand color, so I just went with the Nuln Oil simply to give it definition. Now I could go back and highlight the silver up to give it a whole lot more definition. But my buddy who gave this to me, he is brand new to the game and the hobby and painting, so I wanted a scheme that would be much easier for someone to reproduce if they've never done this before. So that's why I'm going to leave the metal right where it is, and now we're going to turn our attention to the shield, which is the first place we're going to add a very, very contrasting color to give this guy some accent so he doesn't just look like we dipped him in sand. So I thought of using the Corvus black because I didn't want the shield to be a super black, like Abaddon black or a flat black. I wanted it to be like a very, very dark gray. It just gave it more of a weathered, not quite grungy, but the plain black I thought would have been too stark and too strong. And I love the way that the Corvus black came out. It did take 2 coats, though. It's a great color, but it still took 2 coats to cover up all of that khaki underneath. But when it does, it looks really, really nice and clean. So once it dries, we're now going to highlight it up a bit. So normally I'm not doing this on the rest of the model, but that's a lot of just black, and you lose all those details on the shield. So grab a mid-tone black and outline it. So outline the outside edges of the shield, especially anything that's raised. And then I also outlined those panels on the inside, just anywhere where there was a very, very stark bend or twist or edge or something, simply so the shield had some definition. And then for one last layer of highlighting, get an even lighter gray, in this case Dawnstone, and this time go back over the shield, but only do the top edges, not the sides. So we're doing very similar to the shield what we did with the armor. Now, this isn't a true highlighting because it's highlighting as if the light was directly above the shield pointing down. So you wouldn't exactly highlight it like this to give it a realistic effect, but it's easy to remember if you're just getting started. So we're only going to highlight basically the horizontal edges and those vertical edges that are on the edge of the shield that are so pronounced they're going to catch the light. So the shield is now pretty much done. We'll come back with some color accents in a bit, but before we do that, let's turn to giving the rest of the armor a little bit more variety, because right now it's just too much khaki. So there are all these straps all over him. So I chose to go with the brown because it goes really, really well with the khaki. You could do another gray, you could do a green if you wanted it to be more of a camo kind of look, but since it's a desert themed, nothing green here. So a good leather color, and I would say the bolder or the brighter will stick out a little more, where if you do a dark brown, it'll blend in a lot more. It's all about your preferences. But the straps on his shoulders, the pockets and pouches on the front of him and the back will break up all of that khaki color and give him some really nice variety, as you can see here. Now, just like with the shield, those pouches need some depth. So we're going to do a layer of wash on top to seep in and pick out all of those pockets and straps. Also to give the color a little bit of a weathered, worn look to it. That color dries very, very smooth, very, very kind of dull. And so we're going to put the wash on it just to give it some depth, some shadow, and some definition. Now we are going to go back and highlight that leather, but while we're waiting for the wash to dry, let's finish off the shield. So I wanted to give these guys a very, very strong color to kind of set them apart, to give them a really bright color accent. And I knew I was going to put something on the shield and on the shoulder pads. So I picked out just a couple of panels on the shield that were small enough to be easy to paint quickly, but very, very noticeable. And then picked a nice bright color. And I went back and forth, should I do a yellow, a green, a blue? But then I figured, no, the green won't work too well with the khaki, and the blue we're going to use for something else, and the yellow's too close to the khaki, so let's go with red. The red really works well with the dark gray, it works really well with the khaki, and it gives the model that really nice kind of color accent. You could then paint that accent on the rest of your troops, and it will help pull the whole army together. So now that the shield is done and the wash on the pouches are dry, this is actually looking pretty solid other than that weapon. There's only a few other things we're going to do to get him tabletop ready. First, we're gonna bring a little bit of edge highlighting to those leather pouches. So grab a lighter brown or an orange of some kind and just, again, do horizontal areas or areas where there's a very sharp and noticeable ridge, just to break up the brown and to let the eye know where a horizontal plane of those pouches turns into a vertical plane. Now, when it comes to doing visors, blue is kind of your go-to, because if you start with a really dark blue and then highlight up from there, it looks like glass. So a very dark navy blue as your first layer and paint the entirety of the visor with that blue. Once that navy blue is dried, we're going to do another layer of a couple tones lighter, a very bright, bold blue, but we're not going to put it over the whole thing. Pretty much just the front. This visor is nice because it has sharp breaks between the sides of the visor and the front. If it's a nice smooth curve, you'll put it on about the front third or so. And then the last color, again, several shades lighter. This is a bluish gray, and we're going to do a little trick. Paint an L along the bottom and then up the side and curve it just a bit, and it will give the illusion that the glass actually curves and bubbles outwards. It's a great trick. Okay, now we're on to the weapon. So I want it to match his shield, so the outside of the weapon, the ends, the handle, the haft, all of that is going to be that same black as we did with the shield, with the same highlight layers, and it's really easy to highlight it because the edges on this weapon are very, very stark and very, very clear. So you can see, same technique as on the shield, gives them all some definition. Now what we're going to do here is what I would call poor man's or beginner's plasma. I want it to be a nice glowing kind of blue, but don't want to crack out the airbrush. So to start off, get a bright color of whatever you want it to be. In this case, blue, but the other thing I think that looks good with plasma, purple looks really nice, green can look good, yellow can look good, but I'm going to do blue here because it'll match his eyes, quite literally. Anyways, so first, coat the whole center of the plasma with this really, really bright base color. Now here's where some of the magic happens. Go many layers up to a very, very bright light blue. And we're going to dry brush it. And while we're dry brushing it, we intentionally want to dry brush over some of the black parts of the weapon itself. So over the haft and the end of it, because it gives that impression or that effect that the weapon is glowing, and that glowing is reflecting off of the darker part of the weapon. So for our last highlight, we're going to use a bright white. So you may need to either get a new brush or really clean out the old one because you don't want any blue mixing in there. And dry brush again, but just dry brush over those power cells in the middle. And that will give the impression that the energy is most intense in the center and fading and weakening as it spreads outwards. And there he is, complete. Dry brushing, washes on an FDM model, and look at that, it's fantastic. Now I didn't do the base because I wasn't quite sure if he wanted a sandy desert, a rocky desert, plants, anything like that. So the tutorial here was just how to paint the model in a simple but easily repeatable and nice looking desert scheme. So he said it was good enough. Let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you on the next one.